Last of Us 2 is a game that's far better than I expected it to be. Not because I ever bought into the leaks circulating around the game, many of which were grossly untrue in very major areas, or because I dismissed the game as one of those weebs who hate on Western stuff too much, but because I didn't foresee feeling as much emotion as I did upon finishing it. Last of Us 2 far surpasses Last of Us 1 in my opinion. While I think Last of Us 1 is still really good and an easier recommendation for a couple reasons, such as an obvious one of it being the first game and skipping it would drastically weaken part 2, it also has a simpler story of a gruff older man learning to care for another once again, which is a timeless trope that anyone can enjoy without needing to delve beyond the surface level. And just being shorter in length makes it a tight-knit experience that someone could play and simply stop there pretty easily. Even in spite of the conclusion having a loose end that allows for the follow-up to exist and have a purpose, I think that loose end doesn't feel like something you direly need to see addressed. Joel lies to Ellie, but we as the player still understand why because we saw what she didn't. Personally, I wouldn't find it unsatisfactory if we never saw her find out, because the ending still works, just a little differently. Instead of Joel's actions resulting in external consequences, his actions remain as internal consequences. He managed to protect the one he loved the most in the world, but he had to lie to her to do it. The lie being no petty one, but something that fundamentally changes the course of Ellie's life. Joel pretty much knows Ellie wanted to offer her life for humanity, and she'd hate to know the Fireflies had died like animals despite wanting to give everyone peace. There's also the simple comfort of seeing Ellie and Joel alive, even if the world had certainly left its mark on the two. Whereas Last of Us 2 feels more like a game that makes me itch for a sequel. I want to know if Abby and Lev are alright, as we last see them in such a weak and decrepit state, with not so much as a lead to follow, just merely going on their way so they don't die. More importantly, I also want to know if Ellie is able to allow herself to be happy. Sure, she seems to be going back to Jackson where Dina and JJ probably are, but how she's feeling isn't exactly directly communicated to the audience. Furthermore, Dina leaving not so much as a note does indicate a possible rift in the pair's relationship. Last of Us 2 leaving such an open-ended conclusion is in its own way emotionally resonating as a place to leave off before part 3, and it certainly stayed on my mind, but it's nonetheless ambiguity that I'm certainly not alone in wanting to see addressed in the future. However, despite seeing Last of Us 1 as the tighter knit of the two, and believing the simpler baseline appeal is easier to convey to a wider audience, Last of Us 2 takes the series to higher highs and cuts a lot deeper with its impression. Initially, as I played through the game for the first time, I saw Last of Us 2 as relatively equal to Last of Us 1. Part 2 had more to say and refined the combat, especially with even more feedback to the visceral feeling of killing another person, but Ellie and Joel's dynamic in the first game was still so charming that I didn't automatically enjoy Part 2 more. I loved Ellie so much in Part 1, she's easily one of the most adorable video game daughters to ever be conceived, and the feeling I got playing as Joel trying to protect her was not something every game can make me feel. Whenever she was in trouble or I feared her to be in trouble, I played sloppier and rushed through enemy encounters just to get to her because I wanted her to be safe or make sure she was okay. I knew the game would wait for me and I could take as long as I wanted, but I still didn't allow myself to do so, unintentionally reflecting how Joel would be in those situations. Similarly, I had this happiness and pride when Ellie was able to pick up more skills over the course of the game, eventually getting to the point where she could be trusted with covering my back, the same feeling Joel undoubtedly had. Seattle Day 3 rolled around in Last of Us 2, and those memories of the first game filled my brain as I compared the two titles. I appreciated Ellie thus far, as by this point I could begin to reconcile with who she became despite a few years passing that took her away from being an innocent little girl, and making so many mistakes that made it difficult to look at her the same way over the course of the campaign. Really remembering how these mistakes convey the deep love she has for Joel made everything work. Horrible acts committed for the sake of love is no stranger to the Last of Us series, and a lot of who these people were following became as a matter of circumstance. The world itself necessitating compromise on one's own moral compass, and being forced to compromise makes going to the extreme all the more difficult to resist. Killing in Last of Us isn't frowned upon so long as it's for the sake of survival, but being in constant life or death scenarios degrades people's sense of the weight that comes with killing, and makes contempt for others the norm. Ellie is no exception to this, and eventually I'd accepted that, and I just wanted to see where she went by the end, even while being aware of her flaws and seeing how she inherited some of the same issues Joel had. The hot-headedness that she had since she was a child became more of an issue as it was met with more stress from complicated relationships, as she wasn't just connected to Joel but the town of Jackson. The start of the game gives us a glimpse of this as Ellie is the talk of the town for what happened at the party with Dina. Ellie's life has been made easier because of the community her and Joel now have, but being surrounded by others introduces typical teenage issues of fitting in and other people's perceptions of you. So being hot-headed doesn't exactly play nice with that, especially when she was accustomed to an against-the-world attitude from her journey with Joel. So just saying fuck everyone seems to be her natural response to conflict. She's also clearly doing things that Joel would do, like using his map trick when one hostage would point to a location, then another hostage, and he'd know if they're lying when the answers don't match. Seeing her stumble into the same mistakes, bad habits, and patterns, I was along for the ride, because in all of her messiness, you could still see the humanity within her. Ellie didn't do a 180 and become a psycho after Abby killed Joel. She still was able to share sweet moments with Dina and laugh just as any other person would. I'll admit I don't particularly love Dina, she's just okay, but her existence grounded Ellie really well, so she wasn't just in a constant state of depression or angst, and contributed to some really great moments for Ellie. Even in the angstier moments of Ellie, you could see hints of hesitation in this constant question Ellie must be asking herself about whether or not she should be doing this. Maybe she should stop here, maybe she should turn back, maybe she should give up on this quest, maybe someone else is more important. That, to me, is perhaps even more human than those moments she shared with Dina. People are incredibly flawed, and the average person in one way or another wants to do what's right, but sometimes our own desires conflict with what we deem to be right. And as imperfect beings, sometimes we simply give in, because those desires are too difficult to resist, which leads to mistakes and possible contempt directed toward the self for making such a mistake. Ellie gets to a point where it's implied that she doesn't think she deserves to be happy, and that manifests in not allowing herself to be happy. So all that's left is to follow that desire that had already led her to making so many irreversible mistakes. I couldn't help but develop empathy and eventually a deeper sadness upon completion of the entire game, as I just sat there thinking about her for hours, as not only is that self-contempt relatable to me, but desires butting heads with what's right has always been something in stories that hits different in characters I enjoy. However, before the end, what really turned the game on its head was playing through as Abby. Abby might be my favorite Last of Us character. The first time the player saw Abby, she's pretty angry and aggressive toward her friend, and seems to have this simple-minded goal that even her friend disapproves of because it's dangerous. This personality of hers is also seen in how she moves in fights, with this heaviness that's completely unlike Ellie and surpasses even Joel. Then come to find out she was looking for Joel. What makes her killing him even more brutal was that Joel extended his hand to help her. We even physically play as Abby whilst fighting off infected with Joel and Tommy. Abby isn't aware of Joel being the guy she's looking for at first, so something that retroactively stands out to me more is Abby bringing both Joel and Tommy to the wolves' place, out of kindness and thanks for saving her life despite it being against the rules to do so. An act that demonstrates the underlying good Abby still retains, even if she does take her revenge after Joel introduces himself and they realize he's the guy who got a victory royale on the Firefly hospital crew. After this, and not seeing Abby again for a while, I understood why she killed Joel, as the twist that they were ex-Fireflies, or at least connected to the Fireflies, was an obvious one. Something Ellie herself says she was suspecting all along, and we already knew Joel isn't necessarily a wholly good person, but Abby for a long duration of the game wasn't around. Ellie kept missing her by a hair every time, and during day 3 on Ellie's side, I thought the game didn't have much left to go, because Ellie had to see Abby soon, at least in my mind, because I thought there was no way she wasn't at the aquarium. Given the storm, why would she leave? and at least based on the info Ellie had, it sounded like she holed up there, so the two seeing each other at that point was inevitable. I already knew going in that Ellie doesn't kill Abby and decides not to take revenge, because that spoiler was everywhere. So I was starting to feel there wasn't much time for me to feel sympathy for Abby. Ellie not taking revenge would make sense from a thematic level, but wouldn't feel as well handled if Abby wasn't someone I cared for, or at least got a significant understanding of. In my mind, I could only think of two options on how the game would play out from here, both of which seemed really dumb looking back. But it was that they would do one or two cutscenes when they meet to justify Ellie seeing this as wrong when Abby's side is made clear, and or the scars would interrupt their confrontation, so they'd be forced to team up to get through it and see eye to eye by the end. Both options seemed really unsatisfactory, but the game went way further than I imagined and had me play through all 3 days of Seattle as Abby. Initially, I really wanted to get back to Ellie to see what happens when Abby's actually the first one to find Ellie and has her at gunpoint. But having it set in just how long I'll be playing as Abby, I settled down and took it slow. All 3 days are really long, so I just tried not to think about getting back to that cliffhanger, so I could take in what the Abby playthrough was attempting to do. A lot stood out to me about Abby even just from a gameplay perspective. She was better at melee combat like Joel, she could craft shivs like Joel did in Last of Us 1, and she even got a fucking flamethrower like Joel gets. The similarities don't stop there, as Abby's redemption comes in the form of Lev and Yara. Joel in Last of Us 1 had his heart melted by Ellie, as he finally found something to care for in the cruel world the characters reside in. Abby does the same, and using this as a means to feel empathy toward her, despite Abby initially being presented as a monster, was nothing short of great. There's a lot of irony in the fact that the man Abby not only hated, but feared was so much like her. I also love that for the player who went through Last of Us 1, the connections between what Abby is doing in the second half of the game and Joel are impossible not to make. It strengthens the idea Last of Us 2 is going for, of people not being black and white and muddying the lines of who can be pointed to as the villain of the story. Also, can we just talk about this interaction?
Grab any supplies you find.
We can't touch this stuff. It's old world.
Are you... You need supplies. We're not out of the woods yet. Pun fucking intended.
What's a pun?
I loved him instantly. Seeing Abby lighten up and actively try to do this good she stopped being able to do as she grew up in this world became one of the most resonant things in the game. Abby grew up around her dad, who was a doctor and helped others. They were also fireflies who wanted to help the world as a whole, but tragically couldn't accomplish anything. So Abby and the others gave up. Abby most of all suppressing the traits she had that made her want to be selfless and help others. But that spirit returned. A line by Abby's friend Owen really surmises what the characters in this setting need to grasp, and it's simply that they're allowed to be happy. I absolutely love Abby's fight to be true to herself after all these years, and advocating for pursuing happiness despite rough circumstances. What really rode this home was the battle between the wolves and the Seraphites being as horrific as it was, from both losing sight of what matters and perpetuating a cycle of violence. Ellie in her journey falls into that trap, and you can see how it starts driving people away. She prioritizes getting one over on Abby instead of being there for the people who need her. And it's this losing sight of the people that matter to you that Last of Us 2 really criticizes. Not simply that revenge is bad, or that violence is bad, as detractors will reductively mock, especially when the game justifies defending yourself and others numerous times over. Lev killing fellow Seraphites is rationalized by Abby when she says they tried to kill her. Abby killing wolves is justified by them attacking her. And even Joel killing the fireflies so Ellie doesn't die isn't condemned, more so that he has to live with the consequences of his actions. But Joel accepted that, because Ellie was worth just that much to him. Even Ellie, who struggles to forgive him for it, tries to anyway because on some level she sees his perspective, despite Joel saying he would do it again if placed in the same situation. This narrative string is especially driven home by Ellie and Dina having a happy life, even raising a kid, but Ellie, despite being spared by Abby twice, can't forget about getting revenge, so she leaves Dina and JJ who need her. Ellie is a character I can see why some would have a difficult time coming to love again after playing this game. Hell, I had to really reflect on her as I played and try to reconcile with who she is now. I played Last of Us 1 and 2 almost back to back. I took a bit of a break as to not go in immediately and risk being a little burnt out on functionally similar gameplay, but that didn't take an awfully long time. So I saw the little girl within Last of Us 1 become this person tainted by the world as she grew older, and no longer being the most precious thing ever. It was heavy, but that path Ellie went down made a lot of sense. In such a torn up world, one doesn't live there and not have their self fundamentally change as a result. The cannibals did leave a mark on Ellie in 1, especially during some time spent with her after the incident, but for the most part she bounced back. By losing Joel, the one person she probably started to feel would never leave her, she couldn't take it. Ellie as a child in the first game was used to losing people, but Joel was this figure in her life longer than anyone. They went through hell and back together, coming out on top no matter how dire the situations they were in. The world seemed unable to tear the two apart until it did. Seeing Ellie grapple with the effects of that, in at first little ways like her journal entries that display her mental state fighting to suppress the pain she feels, escalating into some of the worst actions she's ever done, is a lot. But I couldn't help feeling deeply sorry for her by the end. As someone who has also felt consumed by powerful feelings that they can't help but give into. If Last of Us 1 focused on love being restored, Last of Us 2, at least for Ellie, focused on the corruption of love. In many real-world situations, horrific acts are committed out of a desire to protect what one loves. Even if that doesn't suddenly make what someone does forgivable, it is undoubtedly human. And at least for the fictional character Ellie, whom I've been able to see since she was little, and witness the world through her eyes firsthand, my sympathy outweighs my disdain. I really latched onto such an arc, because as I'm growing older and making my own mistakes, I've come to see a part of myself in characters like this. Though I couldn't approach the magnitude of their mistakes if I tried, on a smaller scale, I've also been overtaken by emotions that I just couldn't keep in check, and done things I really regret. And unfortunately, as you get older, your actions have more consequences. They have a greater capability of hurting another party more than ever. I often wish to be more like characters I find uplifting, but more and more, negative arcs speak to me in a way I felt represent me. Typically the ones where they do pull themselves up in the end, granted, but even then, the scars of what they've done and the burden of their sin remains. As I said before though, what completes the game and makes it click is Abby. The two sides displayed through Ellie and Abby left a stronger impression on the world as we got to play through two opposite paths in the same game from two characters who are so similar yet different. Ellie succumbing to the path of revenge and Abby redeeming herself. An anecdote I've come to enjoy as a way to describe Abby and Ellie from the game's director is that they're on the same journey, just at different points. Abby not only had her father die years ago, which to an extent gave more time for her wound to heal, but is post-revenge. She already got what she wanted and saw it didn't really change anything. Ellie having Joel taken away from her was a fresh wound with a trail to follow, leading to her downward spiral being all the more drastic. Both Ellie and Abby have experienced a similar kind of loss and easily could have had their positions reversed. As the game indicates, Abby's father would possibly forsake humanity just like Joel were Abby immune, since he couldn't easily say yes to still doing the operation on Abby were she the one on the table. And as we saw from Joel, who once wanted to get rid of Ellie as soon as possible, and have her off of his shoulders. People change. When placed in difficult situations, your actions can contrast the words you said before. If things were slightly different, Abby and her father could have been like Joel and Ellie. Last of Us 2's way of driving home these similarities serves as a reminder that people are people, everyone is human, and just by changing the view, someone's evil isn't as easy to quantify as some might think. In situations where both parties are fighting to survive on a daily basis, there isn't always going to be a clear-cut answer to who is wrong and who is right. No matter how much our current world tries to label all opposition as bad, or tries to recontextualize history in order to have a good and evil, it's not as simple as that. There's blame to be shared by everyone, and every side has its good and bad people. Despite Abby redeeming herself by the end, there's still scars she must carry to remind herself of what she's done, and not everyone will be content with letting her walk free. Same with Ellie. Last of Us 2 doesn't deliver on giving the game one clear antagonist. Discussions online stubbornly point to Joel, Ellie, Isaac, or sometimes even Abby. However, the game itself refuses to do so, as that's not the point. But what it does do is offer a way people can hope to exit the cycle of violence, or at least mitigate their contribution to it, which is self-improvement. Abby developing empathy and helping two Seraphites tells that tale, with Abby not only being physically saved but mentally saved, as she started to bond with the two. In turn, she was able to start pursuing a better world once she herself became better. While it's not literally one-to-one applicable to real life, as no story can really be, it's still a gesture that means an awful lot to me. Same with Ellie sparing Abby, as it emotionally resonates to see someone pulling themselves back from the brink before it's too late, especially when she, intentionally or not, saved a bond much like her own with Joel. Only time will tell if she can make peace with herself.